Here are 20 things I wish I knew in my 20s about working in advertising. The first one is all about getting paid. In your 20s, you're going to get underpaid. In your 30s, you're going to get overpaid. And then in your 40s, you're not going to get paid. That's the reality of working in advertising. At the very start of your career, you don't earn that much money. However, it's kind of like a hockey stick. Every 5 years, you double your salary. And the thing is that you just don't see too many 50-year-old birthdays. As soon as you kind of get to a senior level, that is when you kind of become vulnerable and when you can actually get kicked out of the company. The reason for that is that the businesses can be pretty volatile. You know, you lose one account, you've got to reduce your headcount. And when you're looking at headcount at that stage, it's like, well, we could fire one senior person or 4 junior people. And when you've got lots of work to do, the senior person tends to be the first to go. Knowing at the start of your career that it's going to be short, it's only probably going to be 20 years that you'll be working in advertising. You need to think of your exit plan before you start. Now, you could work in the periphery of advertising. For me, I still teach advertising strategy at the Strategy Finishing School, teaching the fundamentals of strategy. So I'm still linked to advertising in some way, but I'm not in an ad agency. Or you could go work brand side, or you could freelance. Now, the great thing about freelancing is you go back to the same company and you charge them double what you were charging them when you were working there full time. The second most important thing to know is the city you work in will really dictate how much you get paid as a strategist. So for instance, when I was looking at a study of the city and the wages people were getting paid for strategy, it changed dramatically depending on what city you're in. There was kind of clearly 3 tiers in America. You know, you had New York and San Francisco at the top, and then underneath that were like Chicago and LA, and then really far behind was every other city in America. The thing about it is the difference between what you get paid for working in advertising between America and England is phenomenal. Like, you will get almost paid double to work in New York City as you will in London. Now, the budgets tend to be bigger, but people just tend to get paid a lot more money in New York. And that was the same for me. When I was working in Australia, I got paid half what I earned when I ended up moving to New York. Now, the third lesson that I learned was the bigger the brand you're working on, the more people are going to be working on it. There'll be bigger budgets. That means that there's going to be more people on it. So you may be a strategist working on Apple, but you're going to be doing such a small thing. I remember a friend was one of the best user experience designers going around, and they got a job at Google, and everyone was like, oh my God, that's amazing. You're working at Google. They were designing the frequently asked questions page for Google AdSense. This was one of the best user experience designers I'd ever worked with. That really shows you if you want to do big work or touch a number of the different outputs, you want to do it on smaller brands. And that was exactly also what happened to me with the difference when working in Australia and America. When I was working in Australia, the budgets were so much smaller. So the thing is, when I moved to America, you pretty much just put an extra 0 on every single budget. Where a website in Australia might have cost $10,000 to do, in America, the exact same website, no difference, would cost $100,000. And the reason for that is there was just so many more hands touching it, so many more levels of bureaucracy that you actually have to go through. If you do move to one of these big markets or you do move to a big brand, just know that you probably are not going to have the impact that you used to have if you've come from a smaller place. The fourth lesson is it really actually matters where you start your career, right? I actually didn't do this the right way. I started at a very small agency when I started my career. This was actually a massive problem. I started what I'd call it the D leagues of advertising agencies. I was working for a social media agency in Sydney. In terms of the pecking order of prestige of companies and agencies, this was pretty much at the bottom. Now, I had to really fight my way up to work at the bigger creative advertising agencies, the ones that kind of do the TV ads and the big campaigns, is because they've got more control over what actually gets advertised at the end of the day. The agency who's looking after the most expensive part of the project will be the one leading all the other agencies. For instance, I worked for a social media agency. We were one of the lowest down the pecking order in terms of actually dictating what the brand did. We just kind of followed orders from other agencies. So if you want to have a bigger impact and actually make more money, you want to work for the creative agencies. It's actually so much harder to get in into those bigger creative agencies if you haven't had experience there. Now, the thing that really helped me was I used that social experience and then my digital experience to give me a point of difference. When I was trying to go to those bigger creative agencies like BBH and BBDO, having that digital experience that no one else had made me able to open the door there. But if I had my choice again, I would have gone straight for a brand strategy role at a creative agency. They are the top of the top. Then everything kind of falls below there. So it's creative agency or a brand design or brand strategy agency, usually at the top. Then you've got executions underneath that. You've got media agency, then the digital agency or activation agency or PR agency, and then you've got social agencies. The next lesson is imposter syndrome is going to hit all of us. Now, you're going to have differing levels of imposter syndrome in your career. And the reason for that imposter syndrome is most of us are not properly taught how to do our jobs. If you're in account management or you're in strategy, specifically in strategy, roles in strategy, you're often never taught the fundamentals of strategy. You're kind of just thrown the job by your boss and said, just do it, just make it happen. And there's not proper training that's given to strategists. Now, that's something that I try to fix with the strategy finishing school, where I teach people the fundamentals of strategy, because as a strategist, you're never going to be confident if you don't have a solid process and understand why you do the things you do. But just realize that that is rare. You know, only 10% of strategists get that fundamental training in strategy. So if you don't have that at the moment and you feel like a fraud in your job, don't worry, everyone's there. The next lesson is the higher you go up, the less time you actually have to do the work. Now, this is a weird conundrum. You think at the very start of your career, you just feel like you're doing all the work and you don't actually have enough time to think. Well, let me tell you, the bad news is the higher you go up, you start having to manage people and dealing with all their bullshit as well. You've actually got less time to actually do the work that you need to do. So the way that most of us get around this is that we have frameworks and templates that we can rely on. So we actually have a lot more time for the actual doing and not so much time on the admin. In the strategy finishing school, I've got a whole Google Drive, which is pretty much frameworks and templates that I use all the time that save me so much time as well. The next learning I've had is everywhere is a chaotic mess. Often you feel like the agency you're working at is just all over the place and a complete shit show. However, the interesting thing is having freelanced at a number of agencies and even internal in-house brand studios, no one has their shit together. Everyone is still trying to figure this shit out. Kind of take a bit of solace in that, because you probably think, oh, the place I work is a complete shit show. They don't know what they're doing. Don't worry about it. Everywhere is in the same boat. The eighth thing to know is it's not all about your work. You really need to focus on the relationships. And what that also means is you need to focus on the actual politics as well. So at the very start of my career, I thought, if I'm a really good strategist and I've got the best skills, I'm going to make it to the top. That was fundamentally not true, and kind of I got proved wrong on that. What really makes a difference is your relationships, and having those relationships with other people in the agency and also with your clients. So investing in those relationships is really key. Now, the great thing about it is at the very start of your career, office politics doesn't really have that bigger impact. You can kind of sit back and observe the politics at play and kind of learn along the way. Now, you watch the smarter people in your organization, how they get other people on side, how they build coalitions. That's what you want to look at and kind of understand and learn from. So spend equal amounts of time improving your craft skills as you do your people skills as well. The next learning is if you're feeling like people are leaving you out of the process, then you need to bring them into your process. This is specifically for people who work in the creative department or strategy department. A lot of strategists I used to talk to would complain that creatives would leave them out of the creative development process. So then I'd ask, do you bring them along to actually writing creative briefs? The question's like, no, I don't. I write the creative brief and then I present it to them. 100% the wrong thing to do. What you actually want to be doing is bring them in to writing the creative brief. So if they co-author that creative brief, they also feel ownership over it, so they'll be more bought into your creative brief. The other great thing is usually they will bring you in to the creative development. So they'll say, hey, do you want to have a look at the work before we show the rest of the team? Which is what every strategist wants. Now, the same thing goes the other way. If you're a creative, you want to bring them into your process, invite them into your creative reviews, and then see if they'll invite you into the strategy process. The The 10th lesson is sideways diplomacy is the thing that's most underrated by people in agencies. Sideways diplomacy is all about your relationship with people at the same level as you in different departments. These tend to be the people who will make or break your career and your success. So a story from my own career. When I moved to BBDO, I was put in charge of a 5-person team who was heading up communications planning. Now, the success of growing that department for me came from all the business directors in the organizations. It was an 800-person office and there was about 35 business directors. If I could convince those 35 business directors to put on the scope more comms planning hours, then that was how I was going to build my team and be more successful. I focused on having a great relationship with those business directors and was able to build the team out from 3 to 4 strategists to 17 strategists when I ended up leaving. Now, a lot of people would probably have just focused on top-up diplomacy, which would have been trying to convince your head of strategy or your CEO that you needed to have more comms planners on your projects, but that just wouldn't have worked. You needed to get buy-in from people at your own level. The other thing is when you're going for a promotion, you need to convince everyone else in your team at the same level as you that you're worth that promotion up. Because the first question that a boss will get once they promote you is, when am I getting my promotion? And if they can't turn around and say, well, that other person, they're just a step above everyone else, they've already started managing teams, then they're going to be really reluctant to give you that promotion, even if you deserve it. Number 11, there's 2 types of creative directors that you need to know about. And I never knew about this at the start of my career. There's creative directors who are very executional, and then there's creative directors who are very conceptual. And usually the general difference between these 2 types of creative directors are the conceptual creative directors tend to be the copywriters and the executional type tend to be art directors. And how you deal with these creative directors really depends on what type they are. Because if they're really conceptual, they usually are someone who's going to want to be involved in writing the brief, writing the strategy. They'll be very involved in the nitty-gritty detail. Now, if you're a strategist or an account person, your role will be more about ensuring that all the executional elements kind of work together, putting a complete campaign ecosystem together. However, if they are an executional style of creative director who really cares about the craft and a certain piece of execution, then what you'll need to do is try to work out what is the bigger idea. So you'll usually be involved in helping to kind of flesh out what the biggest strategy or idea is. Lesson 12, you want to look for the fast orphans in your organization. When you usually start at a new agency, a lot of people will try to work on the big, iconic flagship project in the organization. So when I was working at BBDO, this was clearly Snickers. Everyone wanted to work on the Snickers Super Bowl commercial. However, they're the projects you don't want to work on because they usually have a number of people who are already working on it and who are already claiming credit for the work that they're doing there. What you want to be doing instead is finding the projects that have the ability to get onto the creds deck, which is, the top 5 pieces of work the agency have done that year, but don't have so many eyes on them because projects like Snickers had hundreds of people involved and multiple layers of bureaucracy. What you want to be doing is finding the projects where the client's more ambitious and they want to take more risks and be more innovative, because that is where you can make a name for yourself, because there's not going to be as many eyes on it, but you've got the chance to actually make some work that everyone will start to notice when you execute on it. Lesson 13, the only real way you make money is when you leave. Now, getting internal promotions, it's just not how you make money in ad agencies. You need to try to scale your salary as fast as you can. And the only proper way to do that is to get promotions outside of your company. So you want to be agency hopping every 2 to 4 years. That's generally the usual amount of time. When you get promotions at the agency you're working at, they generally can kind of lowball you because they've got the negotiating arm there. You're usually not looking for other jobs, so you don't have an idea of your market value, and they tend to usually give you less than what your market rate is because you're already there, and they generally can't give those kind of doubling up of salaries. The only way to get around this is if you are getting a promotion, you want to stay somewhere. It's kind of counterintuitive, but you have to go out and start interviewing for other other jobs, so you at least have some leverage when you go into that promotional chat. Lesson 14 is the process stays the same, virtually every single project. Now, at the start, things can feel like really different from client to client, from project to project. However, the longer you spend in agencies, what you realize is it's just a repeatable process, and the same things keep happening. For instance, every single creative review you go to, I bet you the creatives will not show you the creative work till the morning of the actual presentation. Now, the thing that you need to do with this information is you need to start realizing that you can create a process and frameworks around this, because everything's repeating, so you know how to deal with the mistakes and the problems that are going to arise every single time. That's why in the Strategy Finishing School, I've created that strategy drive. So in there, I've got something called the Framework Factory, which is pretty much 100 strategy ecosystems. I don't have to spend time thinking about the visualization of my strategy. I can just go in there and get inspiration and take that slide and use that. Lesson 15, there's a golden window of selling ideas. Now, this is a crazy thing that I learned by looking at timesheet data. What I realized is that all campaigns at my agency when I was at BBH sold between 90 to 120 days of going live. What that meant was there was a production deadline and clients would buy the work in the same window. Now, the crazy thing about that was we were getting briefed on projects with completely different timelines. Sometimes we get briefed with 200 days to going live to 400 days to going live. Now, the problem with that is that as soon as you get the brief from the client, you want to start working on it and you want to get it through to the creative department as quick as you can. Now, that is an error because you end up wasting and burning out your best creatives, and that account becomes unprofitable because you've wasted so many hours and so many rounds of feedback. What you want to do is actually hold those projects back and only give it to your best team at the very end. Lesson 16, this was one that I got from one of my old creative directors that I absolutely loved. And the best people on his team were the ones that were able to hold on through the rounds of feedback. And specifically, he was saying the people who can make it through to that final, the second last and the last round of creative feedback and still hold strong to the creative idea and not give in to whatever the client requests were, they were the ones that would make good work turn great because they weren't cutting corners. And really, that is what turns work from good to great when you take it from that kind of 95 to 98% perfect range. So if you can be part of that team and show enthusiasm in those last meetings and you can hold on to what the core of the idea is, you're going to make a great team member in any ad agency. Lesson 17 is something that we wished wasn't true, but it is. And that is most of the best work happens when a new CMO is installed. Now, the thing with CMOs is when they're put in charge of a new business, one of the first things that they have to do is show the impact of them joining the organization. And usually 3 of the 4 levers that they've got to pull are kind of stuck or they take a long time. New product innovation or changing distribution or changing pricing. The one thing they can change is advertising. So what you usually find is the boldest advertising usually happens in that first year of a relationship. I know when I was working on PlayStation, we had a new CMO who was brought in and he was just so bold. He actually bought work that we presented in the pitch. And anyone who's worked in a pitch and on a winning pitch knows that 9 times out of 10, that never happens. They never buy it directly off the work you present in a pitch. But that was what he was doing. He had an agenda. He really wanted to set the tone and show that things were going to be different. And he did that. The unfortunate thing with working in advertising is that burnout will come for you. And most people who work in advertising will have experienced this in some level. Burnout does happen. Now, the most important thing to know with burnout is when it's actually happening. And this happened to me when I was working on a Unilever project and the client was absolutely riding us. But I knew it was happening through my body because there's a difference between being stressed and overwhelmed. And that's when burnout happens, when you're overwhelmed. When you're stressed, you're got high kind of energy and you're kind of really fidgety, but you can still think with your brain. The thing where you go over the threshold into burnout zone is when you go from being able to mentally think to mentally not being able to process. And for me, what that looked like was I almost became a robot. I was like very emotionless, kind of like just going about ticking boxes, but I couldn't think proactively. I could only tick the boxes that were right in front of me. When you get to that stage of overwhelmed, you need to let your team know that you're at that state. You need to let the leaders of the organization know if your whole team is in that burnout zone, and they need to help offer you some space. If you're feeling overwhelmed or you're about to get burnt out, the best thing you can do is drop that project for an hour, half an hour, a day, a weekend, whatever timeline you've got on that, and do something else. Best thing I found is just go for a walk. Just try to clear your brain of thinking about that project or the problem you're trying to solve. That is going to be your best solution with dealing with burnout. Lesson 19, the only way to make real money in advertising is not to take a paycheck. Now, what that means is if you are working as a salaried employee, there is going to be a cap to how much money you can make in advertising. The only real way you're going to make money in advertising is if you start your own thing and start taking a cut over the top. Everyone I've known who's made really decent money in advertising has been someone who's started their own agency or started their own product in advertising. That's how you make real money, and also probably how you're able to continue working into your 40s and 50s if you own your own company. The final lesson is that the start of your career is actually the most fun. Like those years in your 20s and 30s when you're working in advertising are going to be an absolute blast. The idea of being in the trenches, working together and solving a problem, there is no better feeling of reaching that finishing line and celebrating with your teammates. Make sure you embrace that. I look back now fondly on those memories. At BBDO, we used to have a bar inside the actual office where you could drink. It was kind of like a speakeasy. And going up there on a Friday night with my team were some of the fondest memories I've got in New York and my time there. So embrace those times, embrace the chaos of the Christmas party. If your clients can take you out, media agencies usually have the best perks. So if you can get in with the media agency and get some of those perks, definitely do it, because they are the best memories you're going to have from your time in advertising. I hope that was helpful. If you've got any other questions about working in advertising that you want the honest truth about, feel free to write them in the comments. And if you're interested in learning the fundamentals of strategy and you're a strategist, check out the Strategy Finishing School. I'll put some links in the comments.